Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Johnson, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the first in a series of webinars focused on data-driven HR. We're excited to see such a great turnout this afternoon and look forward to sharing our perspective, really in hopes that we can give you new ways of thinking about how you can bring more value to your organization as a people leader. And so, without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter this afternoon, Dustin Wells. Dustin is a proven entrepreneur with a passion for people, culture, and technology. His belief in the power of culture found its proof point in his first startup, Headspring. And that's been named among the best places to work in Texas for seven consecutive years. Dustin is also co-founder of Workify, an engagement analytics company, and is passionate about helping companies build great cultures where people can do their best work. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dustin Wells.
Thank you, CJ, and it's good to see everyone on the call today. We appreciate you joining. I'm really excited about the topic today, and we have a lot to cover, and we'll try to end a little bit early for questions. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and then CJ is going to flag me down if we need to get to something right away. But before we dive in, I want to set the background for why this topic is so important right now. Data-driven HR is a newer concept, but it really shouldn't be. And in fact, HR leaders especially need to really understand ways of leveraging data and their role to support the organization. So what we're going to talk about first is really the business case for being data-driven. And I know that I may be preaching to the choir here and everyone understands that that's important, but there's actually a lot at play here. So if you need to build a business case within the organization or be more convinced, then I want to give you that. And then we'll go into how to become data-driven and what does that actually mean. But my stance is that being data-driven as an organization, but especially as a people leader, is no longer an option, it's an imperative. And so if we look at this crazy robot here, technology is killing people and killing companies, or it's enabling people and enabling companies to do a great job. And there's really three different trends that I want to cover here. One's technology, one's business, and one are market conditions. And on the technology side, the key concept here is a thing called Moore's Law. And a lot of you might know what that means, but just to explain it in its simplest form, Moore's Law means that technology will get faster, better, cheaper exponentially over time. And so as an example, we used to have servers that could fill an entire room, and now you have that same computing power in your palm. And that didn't happen in a linear way from the 60s and 70s to now. That happened in an exponential way where things took exponential leaps to get us to where we're at today. And the reason that this is important is this applies to all technologies. And what's scarier though is that the rate of change is getting faster. So instead of taking 30 or 40 years for Moore's Law to bring technology into full adoption at a really low cost point, it's actually happening a lot faster. And specifically as it applies to HR and being data-driven, AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning are two of those things that are on that trend. But we're going to see those two things, AI and ML is what I'll call it for short. We're going to see those two things start to have a lot larger role in HR. And if you don't have a strategy today around collecting data and around managing data and how you work with your data, then you're not going to be able to leverage those trends, and other organizations will. So that's a quick overview on the technology trends. On the business trends, it's really interesting. I call it the rise of the unknowns. And this is really exciting, and it can be scary depending on where you sit. But one stat is the Fortune 500, which is the largest publicly and private companies in the US. In 1955, they put that list out. And today in that list, only 12% of those original companies still exist on the list. And in fact, if we look at the S&P 500, which are all publicly traded companies, their average lifespan has gone from 60 years to 20 years. And so on these lists, if you look at the top 9 out of 10, their technology companies started within the last 20 to 40 years. And these are Googles and Amazons and Apples, and these are all names that we know. But these are the organizations that are leveraging Moore's Law to their advantage and those technology trends to their benefit. And that's why this is so important. So what's exciting is as a startup, you could be in a case where all of a sudden you are leveraging this and you can become a Fortune 500 in the next 20 years or 30 or 40 years in a lifetime. And that's really exciting. And that's a lot different than what we've seen before. And so then the last thing is market conditions. And we've all heard of the war on talent, and this is not getting any easier. And this war on talent, though, really led a shift in the early 2000s, and especially in the late 2000s and the first decade of the 2000s, to focus on engagement. And employee engagement means a lot of things to different people, and we'll go over a landscape of how we're thinking about that. But what's really important and what's newer in the last 10 years is really being deliberate about measuring engagement. And this is why we call it engagement analytics, because it's not just about measuring it, but it's about understanding it. It's about using that data in different ways so that you can benefit the organization. So we're going to give you some ideas of how to do that. So if we look at another trend, these are some of our younger workforce, and millennials is where this all started. And millennials kind of get a bad rap, and I think the good thing that they brought into the workplace is the idea that balance is important and purpose is important. And that was a newer concept uh, before that generation. But then what we see is Gen Z, which is the generation after millennials, and they're in their early 20s, like 21, 22 is Gen Z. They have these same traits. Uh, in addition, what I've noticed about that generation is they're really big learners, they're self-starters, and they want to make an impact and work at companies where they can make an impact bigger than themselves. They want to work for something that means something. They want to have some purpose. And I think they actually feel more passionately about it than the millennials did before them. And so we're not going to talk about all the changes you need to make in your culture because really this is important to all of us. All of us want to make an impact. We all want to work for something bigger than ourselves. We all want to use our skills to help others. And that's not specific to any generation. But what this is specific to these generations is the way that they want to interact with the workplace and with their employers. And so this is a big fancy word. It's called consumerization of enterprise software, and many of you have probably heard of that. But what that means is that the experience that an employee has in their day-to-day life with technology sets the bar and the expectation for the experience they want to have in their work life. And so, for example, if I'm in a restaurant and I want to leave a review, I can do that on Yelp, and I can get feedback to the manager immediately, and my voice is heard or I've left my feedback, and now the manager can receive that feedback and act on it. If I want to make a reservation, I can pull up OpenTable and make a reservation quickly without interacting personally with anyone. It's all done asynchronously. And this is really important because these types of experiences drive their expectations in the workplace. And so what that boils down to is that employees want an easy way to get feedback on their terms. And the reason that this feedback's important is because this is the whole crown jewel of being data driven is the feedback that you can collect from your employees. And that's why you need a really strong feedback strategy in engagement analytics. And so before we go into how to do that, I think it's important to talk about the landscape so that we can frame where engagement analytics sits in the entire landscape of the ecosystem. And so on one side, we've got, and this is the way that we think about engagement, by the way. So when I say employee engagement, this is what I mean. It's all of these things together that equal someone that's either engaged in bringing their best effort and their discretionary effort or someone that's not. No one of these things will create an engaged employee, but all of these together start to create an ecosystem for your company that's unique to your culture, and that's why this is important. So we've got wellness, and we know a lot about that. We understand perks and rewards. Recognition is on the upswing right now, especially digital recognition and peer-to-peer recognition. The idea of culture activation and proactive management of culture is really important. And then we have talent management, and talent management is a really big bucket that has a lot of things in it. And this is where things start to cross over. And so you'll see in this diagram, there's a lot of overlap because there's not really clear lines around any one of these. But talent management is huge. It's around career pathing, it's around collaborative communication, onboarding, offboarding, performance management, goal management. But the thing with talent management that I find interesting and that's lacking is that talent management is really focused on feedback for the employee more at a one-on-one level versus the idea of feedback at scale. And so when you start to integrate all of these things into an engagement analytics strategy, you're starting to get feedback at scale. And that's where the real power starts to become unlocked. And then what we'll cover later, and as we've shown here, workforce analytics is a big part of this. And the reason that workforce analytics I'm covering last is because if you do all these other things, especially on the talent management and engagement analytics, then that is now the ground that you need to sow so that you can have a strong workforce analytics strategy. And so we'll look at how you can leverage engagement analytics into a workforce analytics strategy and why a workforce analytics strategy without engagement analytics is not going to be as strong. So now we have the role of HR and trends that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years. And so I'm really excited about the rise of HR as a strategic seat at the table. And this isn't a worn out topic yet, although this should have happened a long time ago. So we've got the Chief People Officer, the CHRO. These are relatively new compared to their counterpart roles at the C-suite. And before that, HR was seen as more administrative versus strategic. And I think HR is probably the most strategic role in the business that we can have because everything is done by people and everything is done by what those people know and how they interact and work. And if and to me, there's nothing more important than that. And so I think the role of that executive, from a board leader standpoint, it's managing human capital. They're the creator and owner of talent strategy. They drive enterprise change management. They drive culture and purpose, I think at scale. And a lot of that is in partnership with the CEO, and that there allows that leader to now be a trusted advisor and coach to the CEO. And so this is a different way of looking at this role than we've thought about it in the past. And I think that's really important. The other trend that we talked about was culture and engagement and the rise of engagement. And 15 years ago, if you didn't have a strong culture, you could still get by. Nowadays, that's table stakes, and that's what the best employees want to see is this a culture where I can do my best work? Am I aligned with the values and objective of this organization? And then we've seen the rise of diversity and inclusion. And I think what's important here is it's not just for underrepresented groups, but it's also for diversity in thought, because these underrepresented groups, when they come to the table, they bring diversity in thought that's really important and critical. And so the challenge is that we have what I believe is the most important seat at the C-suite. We have all these expectations of this role, but typically what we've seen in working with clients is that the HR leader is typically the most under-resourced and under-invested in executive compared to their peers. And what that means is they don't have the same tools, the same budgets, the same access to technology maybe to enable their job and to drive value for the business as what the CIO might have or the COO might have or the CFO might have. And so the challenge is how do you develop a technology strategy and a data strategy in a world where there's high expectations in a way that's cost effective, where you can show value along the way and incrementally then capture more budget in more ways that you can make an impact on the organization. So there's a lot there, but that leads us to how do you become data driven? And what we're going to cover here are five different points. Data maturity curve, and we're going to talk about where you might be on that and how do you move up that curve and why you'd want to move up that curve. Becoming data driven, as far as what programs and what are some hard examples of how you can become data driven. Why is this the foundation of workforce analytics? Because that may sound like a bold claim, and I want to be able to elaborate on that a little bit. And then importantly, like how do you connect this to KPIs that the entire business understands? And then what we've seen with that landscape, and we'll look at that again in a second, is that this is your data, but typically there's not a clear idea of how you're going to integrate that data and how do you gather that data in a way that makes a lot of sense. And that's where we start to go into BI tools and some other capabilities that you may need as a part of your organization or you want to make sure your vendors have. And so let's look at the data maturity curve. And there's a lot on here, and we'll spend a little bit of time on this slide. because I want to walk you through it. So try to stick with me versus reading ahead. But on the left side, we've got value, and there's immediate value, and then there's long-term value. And on the bottom, what we're looking at is really a cycle of measurement and take action. But the more you do that, the more you can trend and discover things. And the more you do that, the more you can start to tie it to business value and business objectives. And so a lot of people ask, well, where do I start and how do I do this? And engagement analytics, the way that we're using that is really around employee surveys, pulse surveys, and always on channels for employees to provide feedback. And so most companies do an engagement survey every year, and that's one part of this, but there's a lot more value as you start to move up the curve. So let's say you do an annual survey, but you want to move it to a more frequent pulse of twice a year. But then how do you integrate that with growth and development and performance reviews? 360s, 180s, whatever is the right fit for your organization. And then how do you get ahead and start measuring the moments that matter in the employee's life cycle? Some examples might be new hire, exit, manager change, role change, um, stay surveys. These are things in the life cycle of an employee. How do we measure those moments that really matter? And what's interesting is if you start all that measurement, then what you're going to start to see are internal trends and more importantly, internal benchmarking. So rather than benchmarking yourself against others in the industry, you can now start to benchmark against yourself against department versus department, location versus location, at one point in time versus another point in time. And that in itself gives you different ways to discover new insights that you might not have had before. But you couldn't do that if you weren't doing multiple points of measurement along the way. And then what becomes interesting is how do you then take that data and integrate it into other environments so that you can drive new insights that you couldn't have before. And so everything we've talked about is user-given content, right? That's user-generated content. That's employees that have provided feedback. But what if you connected that to sales numbers or to other KPIs that matter to you, customer success, customer support, customer satisfaction? There's a lot of ways you can start to link employee data to business data and start to draw correlations and trends. And this starts to give you an idea of the more committed you are to this and the more frequently and the more rigor you have around measurement, the stronger value you're going to get in the long term, and you'll be getting immediate value each time you do that. And so what does that mean to become data driven? And so we saw this landscape earlier, and chances are good that many of you have point solutions for one or more of these things. And there is a trend in the industry right now to platform this and to move towards a platform. And I think that that's a good way of thinking about it because it's one vendor to manage. I get everything in one box. The benefit of point solutions is you get a really deep uh, experienced product in one specific area, whereas platform plays typically are a little more shallow in certain areas. And so what we've seen in enterprise software, which is one of the companies I'm a part of, is this trend towards microservices. And microservices, all that means is we had the big monolith systems in the past. How do we break those systems up into smaller microsystems and then connect those to talk together? And so the idea of the monolith in enterprise software is dead. And so the idea of going into a platform play to solve this problem feels a little bit backwards to me. I think the bigger question to ask is, how do I get the best point solutions for what I need? But then the two things to consider are what's the employee experience across all those products? How do I have an integrated experience, which is very easy to do in a lot of different ways? And then most importantly, how do I get data and insights across those different products so that I can discover these new things that I might not know? And so the one thing that we talked about earlier was measuring engagement. And when a poll was done, we didn't do this poll, but it's not uncommon from what we've seen in the past. Most companies measure annually, with the second biggest group being less than annually, which is crazy. And so what this means is this is your annual census, and that's the one word that I've heard it called. This is your engagement survey, your annual engagement survey. And typically, what happens is you fill out this survey either via your own tools or through a third party. And usually it takes weeks or months to receive the feedback. You usually get it in a 1 or 2 page report or a single flat file Excel, and now you're left to try to figure out what to do. And this is a really painful process. And so it's no wonder that people measure annually or less than annually, because it's really hard to figure things out. And the benefit that we have today is that the more frequently you start to measure, you can start to automate a lot of this reporting, and you can get to insights a lot more quickly. And so there's a lot of more modern tools today where this is supported. And so what we've definitely seen is the move from an annual survey to a more frequent pulse, at least twice a year, but then layering on other types of programs, which we'll go into a little bit more later. And so we also know that feedback has a half-life, and so this is another case of why you should measure more frequently. There's really high value at the moment you collect feedback because it's most relevant at the time. The longer you wait to take action, the less valuable that feedback is. And so Chris had mentioned the Best Place to Work Texas survey that one of our companies completes, and we've been really proud to be named 7 years in a row as the best place to work. But the irony in that is that isn't valuable to me as a survey instrument of my employees. That's a great marketing award. The reason it's not valuable is it takes me 3 months to get the results from the organization that runs that survey. And so that feedback has a half-life, and that's why at the same time we run marketing surveys, we also run engagement surveys internally, because we want to see the feedback in real time and act on it in real time. And that's why employees will give you feedback. If you're receiving feedback and you're acting on it, then they're going to take action on it. And this is why that's important. So what would a program possibly look like? And there's a lot of ways you can design it. And if there's one thing that we've seen, it's that there's no one way to do this. And culture is as unique to each company as your programs might be. But there are some best practices that you can leverage and take. And one of those is conducting that baseline. And a lot of times we've seen the idea of a drill down. So I do a baseline that's typically shorter. It's about 30 questions. And then maybe that unlocked a certain area that I want to do a deeper dive on. And so I can send out a drill down on that specific area. And then that goes into insights and then action planning. All of these things are important as a part of an engagement cycle. The things that are not shown here are pre-communication and management, and that's a separate maybe topic that we can cover if there's interest there. But anonymity is not covered here. The idea is that this is one example of how you might measure engagement and take action on it. The other thing that's really important that we've seen is linking your surveys, whether you design them yourself or whether you work with an outside provider, to specific indicators that are statistically relevant to driving culture. And so here's some examples, and you're welcome to take these and apply these however you like. But there's a lot of other examples out there. But the reason that this is important is because it helps you aggregate questions up into indicators that helps you understand where you might have an issue. But what's more important is what we talked about earlier, is that if you start linking questions to indicators now, later on, it will lay the groundwork you need to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning. So now you can start to automatically figure out what I should do and why something might be low. And we don't have time today to go into how that works and how can you automatically do these things. But if you have the right structure at the bottom, and this is part of that, it's going to enable you later to be more data-driven and to be able to take advantage of your data. So I think that's really important. Now, when we look at models that are out there, Connexa comes to mind that IBM bought a little while ago, which now they're out of business actually. Towers Watson is a more established player, and Gallup's a more established player. The Gallup 12 was the survey that they came out. And so what's interesting about this model and why I encourage you to take this but then make it yours is because your workforce may be different than other workforces. The Gallup 12, for example, is an aggregate across millions of data points, but chances are good if your company is large enough, especially an enterprise, let's call it 10,000 employees or more, you actually have enough statistical relevance to create a model that's specific to your workforce, and that's not hard to do. But what's interesting about Gallup too is that methodology is based on about 30 years of research, and it was developed over 30 years ago. And so with Gallup, I'm pretty sure that things have changed as far as what motivates employees and why people do what they do. Human development's changed. There's generational differences we just talked about. And so Like using something out of the box, especially an older tool like that, is like using technology that's 30 years old. And so if you want to run a Gallup survey, it's a really strong platform, but send me a fax about it and tell me how it went, or you can call me on your mobile brick phone and tell me about it, because that's the equivalent of using really dated technology to a more modern problem. And I love Gallup, and so I don't want to knock it too hard, but I think it's important to point out. And so now if we talk about engagement analytics and philosophy, uh, this goes to that consumerization of enterprise software that we talked about and how employees want to provide feedback. And so we talked about engagement cycles as a part of your strategy. Another part needs to be life cycle, and we've hit on that a little bit, but how do we measure those moments that matter? And this could be anywhere from candidate to 360s to exits to stays to role change to post sabbatical I've heard of to post training. These are all things that are usually date triggered is a good way to think about these. And then always on anonymous feedback. And so this is a newer concept that some people love and some people are scared to death of because they don't know what they're going to get. But this is the glass door internally for your organization. So how do you have a channel where employees can provide feedback? Think of this as the old school suggestion box where someone could drop something in. But the more modern approach to that is when someone drops it in, you're actually able to start a two-way dialogue with that person uh, while preserving their anonymity. And so when you start to combine these three channels as an example, and you don't have to have all of these, you don't have to have any of these, but if you were going to have a holistic listening and engagement analytics solution, this is probably what it might look like. And these are standard tools that you would see. And so now we need to talk about data, and that's the whole reason we're all here. And so we talked about ways that why you should leverage data, ways that you might do it, but this is really about metadata of the data you're collecting. And I know this is getting a little bit confusing now. So employee metadata is real simple. It's things about that person, gender, tenure, generation, department, location, role, title. There's probably 30 or more per organization. We've seen the average of about 10 to 30. Even for large enterprises, there's no more than that you find meaningful in your organization. And so this starts to get really important because when you collect metadata and you're running these programs in a way that preserves the anonymity of the employee but connects you to the metadata about that employee, and all modern tools can do this, and that's a separate conversation if there's questions around how to do that. But that starts to unlock a whole new level of insights that you might not have known were possible. And so what I'm showing here is an example of what a scorecard might look like. And if this was an aggregate company scorecard, you would see the score for employee net promoter score, maybe for certain indicators, for loyalty and retention, for different types of questions that were asked on a 1 to 5 scale. But then the ability to drive down to, okay, this is for the support center. Now I have scorecards. And when you're looking at analytics, it's important to look for things that are color coded, which might sound really obvious, but anyone can read this and understand what's good and what's bad. And that's the point. And so when you start to look at metadata, it allows you to produce scorecards for teams, for managers, for locations that you can distribute. And this is part of why it's important to have something that's easy to read, because HR doesn't have time to train everyone on how to do it. But the reason you want to distribute these scorecards and get it out into the fringe as quickly as possible is because that's how you take insights and get action on things. And so why is this the foundation of workforce analytics? As we think about workforce analytics traditionally, we look at all of these things here that are all really systems of record. Turnover, headcount, flight risk, recruiting, performance, pay, diversity, benefits. Everything except flight risk here is really recording a system of record of something that's happened in the past. Flight risk is actually a predictive metric, and we can talk about what that means. But these things are really important as a part of a workforce analytics strategy. But if you're not collecting data from your employees as well, and you're only collecting data based on systems of record about who that person is and what they get paid or how they're performing or if they left the organization or not, then you're missing, I think, over half the picture. And so if you were to combine these things with an engagement analytics strategy, that's where you can start to get predictive about things. And so when we talk about analytics, I'll take a quick tangent just to explain like what the levels are and how do you know where you lie on that continuum. And so we've got no analytics that you might be using. Maybe you use static reports would be the second level. The third level is called descriptive analytics. And that's what we're seeing here. That's what I showed you earlier. Those are things that describe the responses to questions or describe responses to things. And then we have predictive analytics, and then we have prescriptive analytics. And so predictive tries to tell you what might happen in the future based on what happened in the past. And this is all machine learning and artificial intelligence. All of this will be driven from that. And then prescriptive analytics is helping you take recommended actions based on what might happen. And so you can't jump from no reporting to prescriptive, but if you follow that journey and you start now with measurement and collecting data, it's going to prepare you for later on to be able to take advantage of some of these trends. And so why else should you ask employees for feedback? Well, Facebook actually ran a study and they found out that the best way to see if someone intends to stay or not is to ask them. And I know that might be shocking, but this is a really good way to do that. And so you saw a retention question earlier, and that's one that we recommend. But in order to collect that data, instead of doing it based on, again, behavior and systems of records and things like that, let's also incorporate their feedback into the process because that will actually make for a better predictive model and algorithm later on. And we believe leaders have a duty to know. And so this is a question that you're welcome to steal. And this is how we help clients measure that in this case. And so now how do you connect to KPIs? And so we talked about surveys a lot. We talked about what's the ROI. There's a lot of change going on. Won't people get survey fatigue? Like all of these things could be concerns, and we've heard all of them. And so there are some common things, but what's really important is, and I'll go over those common things now, but what's really important is how do you connect this to the KPIs that matter for your business? And so we found that EMPS, Employee Net Promoter Score, is the question that says on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend XYZ as a great place to work, or as a place to work, or as a place of employment? There's lots of ways you can word that. And so 0 to 10 is the EMPS. And this was a methodology developed by Bain & Company. This is not a measure of engagement. It's one tool in your toolbox to help you get data around things. And so if you start collecting the retention question, you collect net promoter score, you collect things tied to indicators like we talked about. All of this is data that one gives you immediate value, but as technology develops and as these things go through Moore's law and become more and more accessible for you, you're going to have the groundwork laid where you can take advantage of those things. So we highly recommend this as a question, but not as the only question. And so engagement impacts the bottom line. And there's a lot of stats that you can find. These are some as well. But there's statistical relevance to show that a high net promoter score for employees equals a higher net promoter score for customers. There's also clear evidence to show that engagement impacts the bottom line. And so I'm not going to read through these because I want to make sure we have time for questions as well. But feel free to take a screenshot or you'll actually receive a copy of this webinar at the end automatically by being here. And so you'll be able to pull this if this is of relevance for you. And so we'll keep going. This is data. Okay. So this is really important. This is your data, but most companies make it hard to get your data. And so the most common way you're going to see the data is through spreadsheets. And that's a fine model, but it's really important actually to start building or partnering with someone or a vendor that understands enterprise business intelligence and how to leverage those tools. And so speaking of Moore's law, right, which we keep coming back to, but it's very important because it's shaping the landscape. Tableau is one of the only solutions out there, and this is a dashboard tool where you can throw multiple data things into it and it spits out visualizations and it's all magic. And really the way that this is priced today and the way it's been priced is really large enterprises or small enterprises could afford it, but it was really not very accessible. what we saw with Power BI, and that's the launch of Microsoft's product, by the way, that they charge, I think, $10 a month per user. And so now the same power of Tableau is available to users for $10 a month. And so this is really important. And the learning curve on this thing is steep on any of these tools, but it's really important to start building competency or finding a partner, because once you collect the data, if you don't have a way to analyze it, then you're not going to get any value out of it. And so these are some self-supported ways that you could do that in the middle. And then of course, there's some outsourced ways that you could do it as well. But what you're looking for specifically, if you're looking at point solutions for vendors and you want a way to integrate that data later on, um, what I'd be looking for is something more than spreadsheets, because spreadsheets are fine, but that's a flat file that doesn't give you the relationship between things. And so really I'd be looking for more of an API access or direct database access to certain types of data, especially my engagement data. And so kudos and recognition is another one that you may want API or direct access to data. How many times are certain people receiving recognition? How many times are they giving recognition? What's the overall sentiment of the recognition? These are things that may or may not come in your platform. They probably do. But if you wanted to integrate those insights with other tools, you're going to have a hard time if you don't have right access to the data. And so the reason all of these things are important is because as you collect the data, you want to make sure you can actually get access to it, because then you'll be able to move from that no analytics to reporting analytics to descriptive analytics, and eventually leveraging these algorithms in AI and machine learning for predictive analytics. And so the key takeaways here are big data is not going away. Data is more accessible than ever. And in your organization, you can probably do more to collect data. But if you start building those competencies internally and start collecting your data now, then you'll be positioned well to take advantage of some of these trends. And so with that said, we're going to pause for questions, and then I will give you some time back if we don't have any. I will say if there's anyone that needs to drop off early, we appreciate you being here. If you're interested in discussing more about becoming data-driven, you have questions for me or for us, I'm happy to help you. That's what we do all day. You will also receive a survey at the end of this webinar, because we want to know what you want to hear about. These are so we can make a contribution to the HR and people leader community. And so we really are interested in knowing what you want to see and what you want to hear. You'll also get a copy of this presentation at the end. And now I'm going to stick around for questions.
Perfect. Well, we have a couple questions that are coming in so far, and so I'm just going to go ahead and kind of run through them individually and have Dustin go ahead and answer those. So it looks like the first one is really, first question is, what overall benefits are you seeing from multiple check-ins versus an annual census?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the trend of annual surveys to multiple checkpoints. And the big reason that that's important, even if you don't go all the way up this data maturity curve that we've talked about and these other things, the reason that this is important is because one data point is a snapshot. Two starts to tell you something. Three or four, you start to see a trend. And I think that's where insights become different. And so if I have a snapshot of my, let's just take a real simple example, employee net promoter score is 53, and then next time it's 46, well, that went down. I don't know if that's a trend or not. If I measured that though, let's say in a pulse survey that was 3 questions once a quarter, and now I can see it went from 53 to 46 to 38 to 21, and specifically by leveraging metadata, it was singled out to a specific department. Now I'm starting to get some good insight. So that's really why multiple check-ins and a more frequent pulse is really important.
Awesome. Next question we have here is, how do you connect engagement data to employee metadata when the engagement data is anonymous?
That's a good one. Okay. So this is where working with outside parties makes a lot of sense, because there's anonymity pledges involved in any external provider. And so there's a couple of words that we're using that maybe are important. There's confidential, there's anonymized versus anonymous. And what we are highly recommending is that you are anonymizing your results. And I'll talk about what that means. And so we're not able to pinpoint a specific set of answers to a specific employee, but how do we do that? And so when data is loaded into these systems, the employee name in our system, for example, is stripped out and it's put away somewhere else that literally a couple engineers can access and no one else. And so now we're working off of an employee ID, right? And so we've converted that name into an ID. It's not the ID you gave us because you can link that back, but it's one that we've generated. And so now we can track the history of that employee through all their surveys. Now, how we expose those results is really important. And so what we found in the industry, a standard acceptance level as far as an anonymity threshold is 5 responses. And so if there's 5 responses or more in a survey, then we can aggregate those responses and report those in aggregate. We would never show the individual ones, we only show it in aggregate. And so why that's important is because if you have metadata, but you have a lot of metadata groups like departments with 3 or 4 people, let's say, you're not going to be able to report on that in aggregate because those groups are too small. And so we anonymize it through, and the recommendation would be to strip out that name. There's a link to that through a key that's generated, but then the way you report results is really important, because if I say I want to go to Austin's location with in accounting for people that are male, well, that might be one person. And so at some point you have to suppress that in the reporting and analytics.
Awesome. Next question is really the types of analytics. I know there's the predictive, prescriptive, and that third one.
Yeah. So when we talk about analytics, there's descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. And so it's prescribing what you should do. And these are dependent on the other. So if you don't have descriptive, you can't go to predictive. If you don't have the data for descriptive, you definitely can't go to predictive. And so these all build on each other. And so what's important is that regardless of where you are in that reporting curve, that you start collecting data in a meaningful way now, but that it's well formed, right? I.e. metadata, structured data is really important, because that will allow you to go to descriptive analytics, which is probably the first step that most of us need to take on the call. When we go to predictive, that's really where AI and machine learning come in to help you make links between, okay, this person uh, is disengaged, or this group is disengaged. They've answered poorly on this many types of things. They also didn't get a raise in the last 6 months, and their manager has a low EMPS. Well, that's interesting. That may be a high-risk group, but how do you do that? You do that through computers. It would take humans too long to figure that out. And so that's where we get to the predictive, is now predicting, okay, you might have a problem here. You should go look at this. Or here's what we think is going to happen. Turnover. Predicting turnover is a really good use case. And then the prescriptive is, okay, what should I do about this? Like, how do I action this? And right now, that's really in the hands of HR to help support leaders. But over time, we can start to match interventions with certain predictions.
Looks like we have a couple more questions. The next one is really just frequency. How frequently should we check in with employees, and really how much is too much?
Yeah, so this is a good one, and it's all over the board. The short answer is that it's going to be different for each organization, and it's really about culture and change management. I think that I have opinions about it, and I think that an annual check-in is not enough. Minimum of 2 times a year for an engagement survey, but if you layer on those life cycle touch points, let's say new hire, manager role change, and exit, an employee may be filling something out now up to 3 times a year, which is not overbearing by any means. I'm actually a really big fan too of really frequent touch points of really short surveys. So let's say it's 3 questions and I'm asking the same 3 questions once a month. That could be a really interesting way to build data quickly and to see trending quickly. So if you're just getting started, that might be one way to look at it. Is, okay, I want to run an engagement baseline maybe, but now how do I run 3 or 4 monthly 3-question surveys? Because now I can start to draw trends in my first 6 months of a program. versus having to wait for a couple of years.
Great, great. We got one more. It looks like here, this question is, do you have a recommendation on the number of questions to ask in an employee engagement survey? They ask ENPS questions plus 4 additional questions. They don't think it's enough, but how do you convince leadership?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what you want to measure. I like the idea of EMPS plus 4, and I'd be really interested to know what those 4 questions are. But I think EMPS being the same question is going to give you that trending. And how frequently do they say they ask it? Okay, it doesn't say. So I think that the number of questions is depending on what you want to measure and how frequently you want to measure it. So part of what I just shared was around an EMPS pulse, right, is what I'm calling that, where maybe you'll go monthly and ask 2 or 3 questions. The baseline that we recommend has 34 questions, and that seems really long. But in our model, we've got 6 indicators, right? And we want to have statistical relevance around those. And our IO team told us that 5 questions per indicator starts to lend statistical relevance to those indicators. And so that equals 30. Then we ask EMPS, retention, and then we ask 2 qualitative questions. So that's how our baseline is structured. And I'm happy to share that baseline. And I think we have some blogs around what that actually is as well. But my email's on the screen, so feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share those questions with you as well.
Looks like we have a couple more. Sounds like next question is really about data maturity. And so can you tell us a little bit more about data maturity and what should you implement first?
Yeah, so we talk about the data maturity curve, and this can seem really overwhelming, I think, to a lot of organizations, especially if you're starting from nothing. And so the biggest recommendation would be to do something now. Like, don't wait, and don't. I think it's important to have some good design around it and some good thought about how you want to approach it, but that may be a couple of meetings. It's definitely not months or years. It's weeks at best. And then launch a survey, collect the data. If you can, launch the survey with metadata so that we understand. I know the question about anonymity came up earlier. It's okay to launch surveys that aren't anonymous. Some organizations don't like anonymity, and that's part of their culture, and so that's okay too. And what's important is that you start measuring something. The other thing that's important is that you are measuring similar things over time, like EMPS is an example, or retention is an example, because the more frequently you're measuring that, the more you can start to trend things over time.
Looks like we have one more. Next question is, what is the recommended way to action plan after completing a survey?
Yeah, so this is a good one. And I won't go back in my slides, but if you can picture that scorecard where it had a department on top, I think the best way to do this is to get the data in the hands of the leaders that can make the impact as fast as possible. And when I say as fast as possible, I'm not talking about weeks or months, I'm talking about hours or days. And with technology today, that's easily possible and feasible. And so we've got a client that I won't name the name, but they're about 10,000 employees. And their way of action planning was department level cuts of data. And then the last level of reporting is manager scorecards. So they can actually send scorecards to their managers so their managers can understand what their organization looks like. And those managers can also drill down into the scorecards of their direct reports that also are managers. And so the bottom line here is, how do you design the survey in a way that makes it easy to take action, but then how do you get this in the hands in a way that's easy to consume for your business leaders? And then HR can support the action and the interventions that are needed, but they don't have to actually interpret the results. So I think we'll pause here. And I know we still have a lot of people, it looks like, on the line. We are through all the questions, and I'm happy to hang out for the next 10 minutes and field anything else. Otherwise, we really appreciate you all coming, and hope to see you again for the next one in January.